Hi there. Welcome to the final lesson of our tutorial series. In this lesson, we'll focus primarily on creating messages and buttons and get the opportunity to wrap up the series by finally being able to preview our bot. Now let's dive straight into it. At this stage, you've basically learned about all the core concepts of OpenDialog. During our last lesson, we completed all the intents for the different turns in all the scenes of our buttons conversation. Remember that messages are associated with intents that the application generates. Now, in order to convey an application intent to the user, we need a repository of messages that maps an intent to a specific message that carries the appropriate utterance to the user. At each level of a scenario, you can access messages through the message icon in the action bar. When you click on it, you are directed to the message editor, which gives you a global view of all the messages associated with a scenario, and you can dive into editing them. Now, let's continue with the development of our buttons conversation. We begin by re-navigating to the welcome turn of our welcome scene, then into the intents. Next, we select the message icon. Note that to help with understanding which intent or intents you're viewing, at the top of the screen, you can see a breadcrumb style list of links to outline which group of intents you're seeing. We now need to create a specific message, our welcome message. First, start by deleting the auto-generated message, as we don't need it. Let's now enter the first message that they will see. This message will come before sending any button messages. Note that, for now, we don't need to be concerned with the button behavior. We'll get back to that later. For our first message within this conversation, we will mention that the button message enables you to add buttons that can function as user intents or links to web pages. It can also have a number of different behaviors, such as disappearing after they are clicked or replace text input completely. Next, click on the Add a New Message button. Remember that our bot is entirely button driven. So now let's select Add Button Block. Then add a text prompt asking where the user would like to begin. Our first button will be the button functionalities button, and we'll name it accordingly. Now, for the button functionality, this is the action we would like the button to perform on click. We have the options of it being a URL button or simulating intent button. In our case, this will be a simulating intent button. Now, when the user clicks the button, the conversation engine will match that intent and perform any transition that intent defines. In this case, it'll be a transition to the button functionality scene. Now, for button behaviors, we will be using the same methodology here. But in this case, our simulating intent will be select button behaviors. And finally, other capabilities. Still using the same methodology, but with our simulating intent being show other capabilities. Now, let's go back to the message behavior checkboxes. The disable freeform user input field for this message makes our message look more or less like this, with the text input disabled and grayed out. Now, for the button behavior checkboxes, the override user input field will hide the text input within web chat and show the buttons as the main interaction at the bottom, while allow continued interaction throughout the conversation will allow users to continue to interact with the buttons even if they have moved on from that part of the conversation, which is useful for fax-style chatbots. And we are done with the messages within the welcome user scene. Now, let's navigate to the button functionalities scene. Our welcome message within this scene will be in the describe functionality intent. Let's click on the message editor and delete the auto-generated message. Now, let's create a new message. Note that this message will be similar in form to the welcome message we just made. The first text will describe what button functionality is, then prompt the user to select which button functionality they would like to find out about. This will be the URL button or the simulating intent button, or whether they would like to see other button features. Now for the URL button's turn. The objective of the message within this turn is to demo the URL button. So we'll follow the same process of deleting the auto-generated message and creating a new message. Then we'll enter our first text describing what a URL button is. Then add a button block. In our button block, we'll have a docs button, which will have the link to an external URL. In our case, it will be a link to the message page of the OpenDialog docs. Then our next button will be a simulating intent button. It is a simulating intent that navigates to the user intent, select simulating intent button. And finally, within this message, our simulating intent will be show other features. Now remember that when the user clicks the button, the conversation engine will match that intent and perform any transition that intent defines. In this case, it will be a transition to the explore more in our welcome user scene. Okay, now let's navigate back to the designer and navigate to our last intent that we are making a message for in this tutorial, simulating intent. Now, note in this case, we will be applying the same methodology we used to create URL buttons, but in this case, we'll describe what it is and display buttons that navigate only to the select URL button and show other features. Because these are in themselves simulating intent. All right. Now that we've done it for the button functionality scene, I would like you to try it out using the same pattern, but apply it to the button behavior scene. And that's it. Congratulations on creating your first bot. Now that we are approaching the end of the development of our bot, let's recap and test our understanding of all the different conversational components that we've covered in this tutorial by editing and completing the default welcome conversation. For the sake of time, I'll make this quick. Navigate to the welcome conversation and into the welcome scene. We already see a welcome turn, so we'll add a next turn. Now, select the welcome turn and then select the intent. Note that we have a default app and user intent. We do not need the user intent within our welcome turn, so we'll delete it. Now let's select the app intent and change it to our preferences. We'll set our sample utterance to welcome to the power of OpenDialog. We will not be changing the intent name, as this is a reserved intent name mapped to an event when the web chat loads for a new user in order to provide a way to kickstart the conversation. It will not have a completing conversation behavior as it is starting it. It will not have any transition as the conversation engine will try and match it to the associated user request intent in our welcome scene. Now for the next turn. Note that we'll only have one user intent for now, since we only built the buttons conversation within our scenario. So let's create our user intent called request buttons with a sample utterance of buttons. We'll leave the interpreter as it is because it can interpret button-driven interactions. It will not have a completing behavior and its transition will be set to the buttons conversation. And you are done with the next turn. Now we are left with completing the welcome user turn by creating the welcome message. Let's navigate back to the intent and select the message editor. Now delete the auto-generated message and click on add a new message. We'll give our message the name welcome message. Our first text message will have what our users will first see when they interact with our Power of OpenDialog bot. Feel free to copy my message or add your own creativity to it. Next, we'll add a button block. Then add a text prompting the user to click on the button below. Then add a button called Buttons with our button functionality set to a request buttons simulating intent in our welcome conversation. We now need to know whether our bot even works. So we need to test and validate the conversational experience before deploying our application. Once you've clicked on the preview menu button, you will then see a chat icon appear. Select it. You will then see that our web chat appears displaying your scenario welcome conversation ready for you to interact with it. Note that the conversational context updates to show you the intent that is currently being displayed. And there you have it, a well-designed demo of the power of OpenDialog. Through our use of design principles oriented around the separation of concerns, this bot could grow into something as comprehensive and robust as the current Power of OpenDialog bot used on our site. We have now reached the end of our tutorial series. Stay tuned for our next series where we cover an even more advanced bot using more of the advanced features of OpenDialog. Thanks for your time and see you next time.